Hello everyone, welcome back to the series. We are now moving past our characters, well, kind of. In this episode, we're going to focus on adding all of the logic that we've created for our characters and integrating that into our dialogue files. Hooray! Now we're going to get back to actually writing our visual novels and having things work based off of our files. I know that's something that everyone's been looking forward to, so we're going to go ahead and cover that topic in depth in the next couple episodes. So we're going to work off of, in this episode, we're going to work on adding the actual logic for getting our characters to display on screen and having our character casting data start working. So I have this this testing file here. I've replaced character testing with our dialogue testing, and of course assigned the script for it, and I'm using this test file which we're going to operate on. If I load that up, I've got two lines of text. One for Stella and one for Raylene, so we should see that pop up on screen. Now, my character configuration asset shows that Stella should have blue text and specialized font, but she's only appearing in the standard default font here. Same with Raylene. So it's not reading our character configuration asset, and we only had that working before because it was operating directly within the character class. As we are right now, the dialogue file doesn't even know that a character exists. So let's go ahead and change that real quick and make it where it can access all the customized character details whenever we call them to speak in the file. To do that, we're going to come into our core scripts, head into dialogue, head into managers, and go ahead and start editing our conversation manager since that's where the control over the dialogue takes place. So inside of this script, after we start a conversation, the dialogue system is going to start the coroutine to actually run the conversation. And what we want to focus on is this line dialogue segment. The dialogue part handles both the dialogue and the speaker. So if we look in that, we can see where we are assigning the speaker name to show on screen, but we're not doing anything further than that. So let's encapsulate that inside of the if brackets. And so this is just going to add the character onto the UI. The character name, that is, but it's not going to do any kind of customization. So let's go ahead and run the command that can take care of that for us. And if you remember from our character videos, this is directly within the dialogue system itself. So we can reference the dialogue system, and let's go ahead and grab the instance, and it's the function called apply speaker data to dialogue container, where we can go ahead and pass in the line.speaker data containing the data about the speaker, and just pass in the name of the character. And if we look at that function, of course that's going to go through and grab whether we have the character or not, but it's going to get the configuration of what should be applied for this particular character. So let's save that and check it out. And as simple as that, we've got character customizations running on screen. But that still doesn't make the characters show up in the screen. Now, this is going to be different for everyone who does this for their project. You may wind up writing these things completely different. It's all personal preference, and it all comes down to what's natural to you. For me, what I like to do is, I would like to be able to specify the character, but not have them show up on screen unless I want them to. So just because I say Stella is speaking, I don't want Stella to show up yet. I might want her just to speak without being visible. But if I do want her to show up, then I want to precede her name with the word enter. And if enter is entered behind this character name, I want that to go ahead and apply to the character data and say, once this character starts speaking on this particular line, make sure that this character is not only created, but made visible in the scene. So we need to look for this very particular keyword and make sure that the logic is in place for that. To do this, we need to come into our data containers for the dialogue and go into our speaker data and make sure that that variable is something that can be assigned. So inside of our speaker data, we have this function, the constructor, which creates the whole data class here. But we're missing that particular keyword. So let's start with a constant to let us know what key will cause the character to enter into the scene. We can make this a private constant string and call it something like enter keyword. And that will simply be enter followed by a space. And so when we actually go ahead and process this, we want to make sure that we process it before we actually start processing any of the other casting data. So we'll go ahead and do that right up top, and we'll make a separate function for that. So let's go ahead and say private string. We're going to alter the actual raw string and return a value that takes out the keywords and goes ahead and applies some variables to whatever keys it finds. So we'll call this function process keywords. And it's going to take in the string for the raw speaker. And so then what we can say down here before we do any logic is we'll say raw speaker equals process keywords raw speaker. And now the logic that we're going to put in here is just a simple check for that enter keyword. So if raw speaker dot starts with enter keyword, then we want to go ahead and do something. We'll first of all remove enter from this speaker and say that raw speaker equals raw speaker dot substring starting at the enter keyword link. So we're just going to remove it. And then we need to assign a variable that the conversation manager can check and go ahead and force the character to come into the scene. And we'll do this with just a variable called make character enter. So right up top, let's go ahead and make a public boolean because we need the other class to access this. A public boolean called make character enter, which will be false by default. But if we have that keyword, then make character enter will equal true. And at the very end, we'll just go ahead and return the raw speaker. So that'll go ahead and process our keyword. And now that we have that, we'll be processing this, of course, in the dialogue portion of our conversation manager underneath this line.hasSpeaker. So if we have a speaker, let's go ahead and check if this character is set to enter the screen. So let's check if line.speakerData.make character enter, then let's make the character enter. We'll do that by accessing the character manager.instance and say .create character. And the character we're going to cause to enter will be the line.speakerdata.name, and we'll go ahead and make it to where this character will reveal after they are created. But currently we don't have any parameters for this. All we have is the ability to create the character, and if they're invisible by default, which we should make them invisible by default now, then we'll want, in this instance, for the character to be visible when it's created. So let's jump to this function real quick by control-clicking the name, and let's add an additional parameter that can force this character to be revealed. First of all, we need to go into our character class and change enable on start from true to false. That way, whenever we create a character, it's just automatically invisible. That may be something that you don't want. For me, I definitely want that in there. Now for create character, now it would make sense for me to add in a boolean called reveal after creation and just set that equal to false by default. And so at the very end, after we add this character to the dictionary, let's check if reveal after creation, then call character.show. And in the conversation manager, there we go. It knows what we're doing. And let's go ahead and say reveal after creation is true. Sure, with that being the only parameter, I don't need to specify the name of the additional parameter, but it just helps with readability. That way I don't have just some random true variable that I come back to later and I'm like, what does that do? I already know because I show the name here. So this should go ahead and make our character visible in the scene. Once again, I'm running Stella here. Well, first, before I do that, let's go ahead and say Stella just to give another line. So call this the first line, and then we'll move into enter. So the first line runs, and the second line runs and causes Stella to enter in the scene. Now, if I go back in, and I decide to type in enter twice, and have Stella enter on both of these scenes, so because of the safeguard in place, we won't create a second Stella, but we will get this warning saying that character called Stella already exists, did not create the character. So it is trying to create the character twice. So let's just add in an additional bit of logic that will only try to create the character once, and just try to reveal the character anytime after that. So to do that, let's go ahead and try to get the character first. So we'll say character equals character manager dot instance dot get character. We'll try to get the character by the line dot speaker data dot name and just ensure that create if does not exist is false, which it is by default. So if line speaker data.make character enter, let's go ahead and do another encapsulation and just say if character equals null. So if there's no character, then create the character. Otherwise, character.show. So if we run this now, our first line forces Stella to enter, but if I just come into her main root object, take her visibility all the way down, press enter again, then the second time it calls enter, it just makes her reveal herself in the scene because she already exists. Now, we can also do casting data for the character, and this should be able to process everything that we want to apply on the character immediately when they start speaking. So far, we have 3 different types of things that we can cast, which is the display name, so we'll call Stella as question mark, question mark, question mark, and then we'll say at 1, so I want her to move to position 1. And then inside of the brackets, I will go ahead and define her expression, which will just be on layer 0, and we'll call, for her body, we'll make it 4, and then on her face, which is 1, we'll make that happy 4. But of course, the only thing that we have working is the name casting. We don't have position or expression casting, so let's go ahead and add in that functionality. To clean up our little function here for running dialogue, we're going to have a few more lines for speaker data, so let's go ahead and take all of this for the speaker, and just cut that. Actually, hang on. I got confused for a second. I thought this was me telling it to build the line, but no, that's down here. Okay, massive brain fart. So let's go ahead and cut all of that. And then let's make a new function down here, private void handle speaker logic. And this is going to take in our DL speaker data for speaker data. Inside of here, we'll go ahead and pop that in there, remove line, and remove line off of these instances as well. And then if we have a speaker, then let's go ahead and just handle the speaker logic, passing in the line.speaker data. There, so we can clean that up just a little bit and make that more suitable for our dialogue section, which is what it's called. So if we have our character, let's go ahead and make it where we can actually apply the position. So let's jump into our speaker data real quick. And you can see we have a spot for our cast position, which gets cached in there. And we have a list for the expressions that we'll cast to this character, just in case our character is using multiple layers. But we don't actually have a way of checking if a cast position has been assigned or not, because even if it's at default 0, 0, 0, 0 is still positive for the bottom left corner of the screen. So we're just going to need to implement a couple booleans to show us whether we have casting information or not. Even though we can check the variable and we can probably see, for the vector2, it's not going to be as easy as the display name and the cast expression. So we'll just make one for all of them. So we'll make a public bool is casting name, and this will simply be if our cast name is not equal to string.empty, which means up here in this section where we check for the display name, we can just check if we're casting the name and then return the cast name if we are. Now for casting position, public bool is casting position. This one's just going to be defaulted to false because we'll need to assign that manually. And we'll come down into the speaker data constructor, and right here where we are checking for the position cast ID, if we find it, then we'll go ahead and say is casting position equals true. And now for our expressions. Public bool is casting expressions. We will just point that to our list and say cast expressions.count is greater than 0. Okay, so now we know if we're casting everything. So back in handling speaker logic, we can now check. So after we apply the speaker data to the dialog container, let's go ahead and check if we need to cast the position as well. We can check by looking at speaker data.isCastingPosition, and if we are, then we'll just want to say character.move to position, and we will move to the speaker data.cast position. Now, before we do the expressions, let's change one thing here. if we are trying to cast the position of character, so far, before I say anything else, so far our character is only being created if we are making the character enter the scene. Which means if I don't specify enter for a character, but I do specify casting data such as a position or an expression, then when I do specify for that character to enter, they're now going to spawn at that point and they won't have any sort of configuration for my previous casting information. So if I cast a data to go into the right side of the screen, but I don't want them to show up yet, so I don't use the enter keyword, when I use the enter keyword, say a line later, they'll show up in the middle of the screen because it hasn't cached that casting data. So if we are using casting information, such as the position and the expressions, in order to save that, we want to make sure that the character is created. So we're just going to want to create a little boolean that tells us if we should create the character or not. So boolean, we'll call this character must be created. And we're going to set this equal to true if any of the following criteria is met. So if speaker data dot make character enter, we know that the character must be created for that. Or if our speaker data dot is casting position, and lastly, if our speaker data dot is casting expression, since these are the sort of things that we want to make sure we save. And so in that case, when we go to retrieve this character, create if does not exist should be character must be created. That way, if any of those are true, it'll make sure that when it tries to retrieve the character, if it doesn't exist, it'll go ahead and create it. Which means we can go ahead and come in here and remove this null check and remove this as well. Actually, we're going to remove, let's just go ahead and remove all that real quick. All we need to do, since we make sure that the character is created when we need it, the only thing we need to make sure of when we cause the character to enter is they need to show up. So character.show. But let's add just a little more of a check here. We don't want to run that if we don't have to. So we may specify that we want them to enter into the scene, but only if the character is not visible. And I literally just went through all that and did not record it. So we're going to start over from this portion here. Don't worry if you're watching, you didn't miss anything. I just neglected to record everything else preceding this point. So I didn't erase it all, so we're just going to go over some of the things that I did as we get to it. But for this portion, before we make this character show up, we first want to obviously make sure that this character is set to enter, but also let's check another thing. Let's make sure that our character is not already visible. As long as our character is not already visible, and we want to make them enter, they'll show up. And also, not character.is revealing. We don't want to go ahead and force this show command again if we're already visible, or if we're in the process of revealing. So then we've got our casting position, so our character is going to move to the position, and the only thing that's left for us is casting the expressions. So let's go ahead and check if speaker data it is casting expressions, then we want to do something here. We're going to say for var ce in speaker data cast expressions, ce just standing for cast expressions. That should be for each, not for. Had to make sure I was recording again. Sometimes that pause button messes me up, as it did a second ago. And what we're going to do is we're going to go ahead and call a function on our character class. So we'll say character.onReceiveCastingExpression, which you don't have just yet. So let's look at that. This is one of the things that I did not record. So if we look at that, inside of our base character class, all it is a virtual void which does nothing. But it takes in a layer and it takes in an expression, the exact data that's saved in our cast expressions for our characters. And what this is going to do is it's going to allow us to define what happens when we cast an expression to each different character type. For sprite characters, they will need the layer, and they'll set the expression as a sprite onto that layer. And it'll just be different for each one. So if we look at the character sprite, the first thing that we do is we try to grab the sprite. We're going to get the sprite based off of the expression that's being passed in, and as long as that sprite is not null, then we're going to go ahead and transition to that sprite on the layer that has been specified. That's for the sprite character. For Live 2D, we're going to ignore the layer, and we're just going to use the expression. And we're going to go straight into setting the expression for this character. And for Model 3D, again, we're going to ignore the layer and set the expression on this character, which is the blend shape, and that'll be the expression name followed by the weight we want to assign to that blend shape. And I'm just defaulting that weight to 1, so that way when we cast an expression to the character, we maximize its weight on the expression controller. So then in Conversation Manager, what we can do as we call onReceiveCasting expression is we can pass in the ce.layer and the ce.expression. And then we are effectively casting the expressions for these characters. So with all that in place, this should go ahead and process our casting information. So real quick, let me just go ahead and remove that so we can see what this looks like first. So without all the casting, that is what we have. Stella shows up, she's using her normal name, she's at the default position with the default expressions. But with casting on, we're going to set the name, the position, and the expressions. And yeah, we can see that doing that, we indeed set the casting name, the expression on both of her layers, and her position. Now, to make this easier on ourselves, if I go to set an expression for a character that is not multi-layer, but only uses one image for the whole body expression and everything, it wouldn't make much sense for me to type in the 0 layer followed by the expression that I want. It's just not very intuitive, not very user-friendly there. What I'd like to do is for these characters, simply specify only the expression name and have it automatically determine that this is for the first and only layer for the character. Such as in this case for our female student, which is a single layer character. But if I go ahead and try to run this, you can see that we get an error in Unity saying the input string was not in the correct format. And if we look at that, it's coming to our dialog speaker data here, where when it's caching or splitting this expression data, it's automatically looking for 2 parts. So it's expecting 2 parts when we only technically need 1. So let's go ahead and default this to say that if our parts.length equals 2, meaning we have both a layer and an expression, then we're going to go ahead and return the layer and the expression. Otherwise, we're going to return a default, and that default is going to be defaulting to layer 0, which would be the first and only layer of a single layer character, or going ahead and defaulting to the first layer of a multi-layer character if we don't specify the layer. And then we'll go ahead and say parts 0. So that way we can pass in the layer or just an expression for the first and only layer. And doing that, we are now able to call our secondary character, our single layer character, and give them an expression cast that's much easier to write in the long run. So there we go. There is a basic integration so far. We can go ahead and make our characters enter and take care of their expressions and all of their casting data. So in the next episode, we're going to move on to integrating the commands and making sure that all the logic that we've given our characters so far can be called as commands directly from our dialog files. Till then, see you guys next time.